So it is wonderful to see so many friends, colleagues, students, members of the community here. Those of you who've been following our programming closely know that we've only transitioned to in-person events very, very recently. So I'm so pleased that this particular event could be in person, and it will be subsequently aired online, where the Leve Center has been able to amass a really remarkable following for our events, which is wonderful. So today we gather for an event entitled Between City and Shtetl, a comparative look at contemporary Hasidic life, which is a celebration of two books. My colleague, Professor David N. Myers, my friend, well, they're all four my friends, so I won't keep repeating myself, and Nomi Stolzenberg's book, American Shtetl, The Making of Kiryas Joel, a Hasidic village in upstate New York, and Michael Casper and Nathaniel Deutsch's book, A Fortress in Brooklyn, Race, Real Estate, and the Making of Hasidic Williamsburg. And we will be joined after our presentations by booksellers, and so you can get your book purchased and signed and headed to your bedside table. This program is brought to you by the Naftulin Family Lecture series on Jewish identity and the Michael and Irene Ross program in Yiddish Studies, and co-sponsored by the UCLA Department of History. We're thankful for all of these sponsors. And I want to just also send a flag up that we have a rather remarkable event soon in which we offer our L&D Levy Award to Professor Andrea Ghez, our UCLA colleague and Nobel Prize winner from the Department of Astrophysics, on May 22nd in the Luskin Conference Center. And information about that is in the back as well. As always, I want to thank our wonderful staff who are all gathered for all their hard work. So it's estimated roughly that there are 400,000 Hasidic Jews in the world. Actually, my guest can correct me or not if I'm right on those numbers. Broadly speaking, adherents of the influential mystical Jewish movement with its original roots in 18th century Poland, when its founder, the Baal Shem Tov, rebelled against what he perceived as the rigidity of rabbinical Judaism and introduced a form of asceticism, mysticism devoted to celebrating the presence of God everywhere with holiness, joy, dance, and prayer. In the United States today, it's estimated that there are about 200,000 Hasidic Jews, about half of whom live in Brooklyn. The books we are here to celebrate and discuss today explore the Yiddish-speaking Satmar Hasidic community, the largest Hasidic group in the world, with somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 followers. And the Satmars specifically trace their roots, as both of these books explore, to Hungary, and have been understood to follow a form of radical austerity and isolation, although that is a perspective that our books and authors challenge and question. But briefly, for those of you who are new to the story, and I'm sure our authors will say more, the Satmars settled in the Williamsburg neighborhood of Brooklyn in the late 1940s, led by a charismatic founder, Joel Teitelbaum, a man who was, as our authors tell us, spared from the Nazi genocide by spiritual historical circumstances that are still debated to this day. But Teitelbaum preached that America was a wilderness, that Zionism was an affront, and that the Satmar community required a rigid barrier between it and the wider society, both Jewish and non-Jewish. After this initial movement to Brooklyn, as other whites, including other Jews, left Brooklyn for wider, richer neighborhoods and boroughs, suburbs, in the years between, well, the late 1950s and 1970, the Satmars dug in. They cannily and assiduously, and this is just a marvelous part of both books' discussion. I mean, this is really Michael and Nathaniel's book explores this in its Williamsburg incarnation. They dig in cannily and assiduously, acquiring and maintaining federally supported high-rise housing for their rapidly expanding community. And there they live gingerly, at times with tension, alongside mostly Black and Puerto Rican neighbors for many decades, until a new breed of residents, as Nathaniel and Michael described them, the hipsters, or the artistan, begin to flood in, with many secular Jews among them. But there are offshoots. In 1972, in utter secrecy, Satmar leaders buy a parcel of land in Monroe, New York, roughly 50 miles northwest of the city, and this is home to a new suburban enclave of the community known as Kiryas Joel, a community whose founding took part, as David and Nomi teach us, ironically enough, in the post-war context of the suburbanization of America that would take place alongside strict segregationist lines. Now, previous scholarship on Haredi or ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities, of which the Satmars are a part, has focused primarily on internal dynamics. Haredi strategies of communal boundary making, religiosity, birth rates, or in a couple of cases, I'm thinking especially of Ayala Feder's Mitzvah Girls, the margins of Haredi society. But here we encounter, wonderfully, two books with a radically different approach to the subject matter, and yet very much in the spirit of one another. A Fortress in Brooklyn, Race, Real Estate, and the Making of Hasidic Williamsburg by Michael and Nathaniel, asks how the Satmars of Williamsburg survived, and I'm quoting them here, in one of the toughest parts of New York City during an era of steep decline, only to later resist and also participate in the unprecedented gentrification of the neighborhood. This book, exhaustively researched and tightly, beautifully woven, Michael and Nathaniel demonstrate that Williamsburg's Hasidim rejected assimilation, but crucially, while still undergoing a distinctive form of Americanization and racialization. So A Fortress in Brooklyn argues at its heart that, and again I quote, far from being timeless or unchanging, Hasidic Williamsburg was shaped from its very beginnings by a series of internal transformations and a dynamic set of historical forces at the center of urban change in New York City during the post-war period, particularly, unquote, particularly at the intersection of questions of race, real estate, and religion. On the other hand, and yet it's a joined other hand, on the other hand, but in tight conversation, David and Nomi's American Shtetl traces the creation and complex shaping of Kiryas Joel, which they describe as, quote, a thriving insular enclave and a powerful local government in upstate New York. To David and Nomi, Kiryas Joel is a stunning success story of a community that simultaneously rejected American mainstream norms, while nonetheless using the instruments of secular, political, and legal power that the community itself disavowed. American Shtetl elegantly, laboriously traces the roots of Satmar Hasidism in the 19th century Europe and Hungary particularly, but really at the heart of the book is an examination of how late 20th century legal battles, carried out even in the very highest American court, shape and nurture this community. And what I'm really struck by is that for all of this, all of our authors, but now I'm speaking particularly of American Shtetl, Kiryas Joel provides an access point not only to Haredi life, but to the impulse to self-segregate, which is shared by a growing branch of American conservatism, Jewish and not Jewish. To our guests, I think we actually all know them well, but they deserve their accolades and formal introduction. Nomi M. Stolzenberg holds the Nathan and Lily Chappell Chair at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law. She has written widely on law and religion in distinguished venues such as the Harvard Law Review and the Oxford Journal of Legal Studies. David Myers holds the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History here at UCLA, and his many books include Jewish History, A Very Short Introduction, and The Stakes of History on the Uses and Abuses of Jewish History for Life. Nathaniel Deutsch is a professor of history at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where he holds the Baumgarten Chair in Jewish Studies. Among his books are The Maiden of Ludmir, A Jewish Holy Woman and Her World, and Inventing America's quote-unquote worst family, Eugenics, Islam, and the Rise and Fall of the Tribe of Ishmaeli. Michael Casper is a historian of modern Eastern European Jewish politics and culture, a holder of a PhD from our very own Department of History, and a contributor to the journals American Jewish History and the New York Review of Books. Now, before I relinquish the microphone after far too long, I will explain how we will proceed. I've asked each of our speakers to try to stick to the rather narrow window of 15 to 20 minutes each, after which I will offer a couple of questions of my own, but before they even answer those questions, invite yours and allow the four guests to select among those questions to offer what reflections they will. So please join me in welcoming our friends.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's really hard to describe how much of a delight it is to be back here. A room that many of us know very, very well. And it had many memorable and very stimulating afternoons and evenings. And I do want to extend my deep thanks to the peerless staff of the Leve Center, seated back there, as always. They outdid themselves. And I just want to say what an incredible pleasure it is. Nomi and I have been waiting for this moment to sit together with Michael and Nathaniel to talk about our books. They are parallel lines that meet up in a feat of mathematical exception. Because they're both dear colleagues, and one was a dear student of mine here at UCLA. But also because, really, in parallel, we worked assiduously, and as Sarah said, laboriously, for, in our case, almost 2 decades, on projects that were remarkably close to one another, that are in many respects 2 sides of the same coin. And that is, Nathaniel refers to it as sort of a revolution in Satmar scholarship. Right? We have sort of elevated the field of study of Satmar Hasidim to a new level with these 2 books, one of which deals with the main capital of the Satmar universe in Williamsburg, and the other with a contender to that throne in what is known as Kiryas Yol. So I'll explain what Satmar is, I'll explain what Kiryas Yol is, or Joel, or KJ, all 3 of which are cognates for the same idea, and our dear colleagues will explain about Williamsburg. But why is it that you have 2 big books on what would seem to be a rather narrow topic? And the answers are manifold, but one of them is we have simply devoted, as a society, and certainly within the field of Jewish studies, and to a certain extent the Jewish community, much more attention to the phenomenon of what we call Haredi Jews. Haredi from the Hebrew word for tremble, also the word for anxiety, comes from that 3-letter root, which is found in the book of Isaiah to refer to trembling in the presence of God. Haredi Jews tremble in the presence of God and do so by adopting a particularly stringent form of religious observance. Of Haredi Jews, in the latest estimates issuing from a research group that Nathaniel and I are part of, suggest to us that 1 in 7 Jews in the world is Haredi, 1 out of 7, just over 2 million. Of which a very substantial proportion, certainly the plurality and likely a majority, are Hasidic Jews. That is to say, followers of a pietist movement that took rise in the last third or so of the 18th century. That's actually positioned itself in opposition to the Torah elite of Lithuanian Judaism. And in one of those remarkable twists of irony, those 2 points of origin, radically opposed to one another in the late 18th century, are now conjoined under the rubric Haredi. That is to say, Lithuanian Talmud culture, yeshivish culture as it's known, and Hasidic Jews. So the numbers, and Sarah's not at all to be faulted because they change by the hour, the numbers are much higher than we used to think. And estimates are, according to this most recent study that was launched in the UK and will be launched on the website of the research group I just mentioned, suggests that in 20 years, in 2040, 1 in 4 Jews in the world will be Haredi. So this is a phenomenon of incredible relevance and significance to understanding contemporary Jewish life. That, I would say, was punctuated by the year 2020. In the year 2020, 2 important things occurred. One, a global pandemic began. And the second, there was an exceptionally contentious presidential election in the United States. I'm sorry to remind you of both of those factors, but they're quite relevant to the subject at hand. Why? Because Haredi Jews in 2020 achieved a new degree of visibility in the public square, asserting a very powerful position, especially under the aegis of religious liberties that was quite different from sort of the reputation of Haredi Jews as quietists, as willing to forge their own distinctive brand of ritual observance, but adopt a position of subservience, of obeisance to the state. Something seemed to change in 2020, and the regulations imposed upon the public by authorities concerned about COVID fell particularly hard on the Haredi community. So what do I mean by that? To close down a synagogue and not allow particularly men to discharge the obligation of praying 3 times a day. To close down schools and not allow the many children of Haredi families to get out of small cramped apartments. These were felt as not just significant burdens, but really violations of their rights. In similar fashion, or in parallel, those who represented and promoted the ideal of religious liberties tended to be on the right side of the political spectrum, and very often looked to Donald Trump as their most important bearer of the message. And we saw a phenomenon that Nathaniel and I are really interested in exploring at greater length, amongst many others. We saw in 2020 a rather remarkable shift in Haredi electoral behavior. So just to give you one example, in the community that Nomi and I studied in 2016, a little over 50% of the community who voted for Donald Trump. And in 2020, 99% of the community voted for Donald Trump. Something happened in 2020 was a precipitate. And this is one of the reasons why the subject has become much more relevant and topical. This desire to understand what's going on here. What's going on demographically, what's going on politically and culturally. And our books, I think, move towards a richer, more textured, more nuanced explanation of this phenomenon. What we all study, however, it's important to add, is not just what's going on within this small and but larger and growing group of Jews, often deemed exotic and alien, and indeed that's an impulse that we quite assiduously sought to resist. But studying this group tells us a lot about America. Tells us a lot about religion in America. Tells us a lot about the intersection of law and religion in America. Tells us a lot about housing in America, as we'll hear. In fact, our book is entitled, American Shtetl. And in just the next couple of minutes, I want to lay out what's Shtetl about this phenomenon, and then hand over to Nomi, who's going to explain what's American about the phenomenon. So the word Shtetl is the Yiddish word for a small town, literally small town, that really is meant to convey the idea of a holistic, self-contained, segregated, scrupulously observant Jewish community from Eastern Europe, where the largest body of Jews in the world lived up until the Holocaust. That, at least, is the mythic ideal familiar to us from, say, Fiddler on the Roof. Sort of this wonderful, organic, holistic community comprised of like-minded people, all committed to upholding the values of Torah, at least until the communist revolutionaries come and begin to disrupt things. In fact, that image bore little resemblance to what an actual historical shtetl was, which was indeed a neighborhood, a community, a town that contained often an explosive diversity of Jews. Jews of many different religious, socioeconomic, and political gradations. And a community that was often embedded in a larger community such that it was never splendidly isolated from the larger non-Jewish community. What is interesting about the community that we studied, Curious Joel, New York, a legally recognized municipality in the state of New York, 50 miles north of New York City, is that it actually resembles the mythic version of the shtetl far more than the historical version of the shtetl. It resembles that mythic kind of Fiddler on the Roof ideal, and indeed was conceived of that by its first formulators. The first formulators were contemporaries and disciples of the founding figure of the Satmar Hasidic group. So Hasidism arrives in the late 18th century. There's no such thing as Satmar Hasidim until the 20th century. So Satmar Hasidim are a relatively new entry to the world of Hasidic culture. And they drew inspiration from the scion of one of the most important and contentious families in the Haredi world of Hungary, which was itself one of the most fascinating incubators or laboratories of Haredi culture in the world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Teitelbaum family settles in the northeast quadrant of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Joel Teitelbaum is born in 1887. He becomes heir to the family tradition of a kind of combative, aggressively combative Haredi Judaism. Makes his way to what after 1920 became the town of Satu Mare, not Satmar, which was not a wholly Jewish city, but rather a city in which a quarter of the population was Jewish. It was a multilingual, multicultural, multi-ethnic, East Central European small city. And there in 1934, Joel Teitelbaum establishes a circle that would come to be known as Satmar Hasidim. The community lasts only 10 years there because, of course, in March 1944, Nazi Germany invades Hungary, breaking the alliance that Hitler had with Admiral Horthy, and within 3 or 4 months deports 3/4 of the Jewish population of Hungary. Included amongst them were 3/4 of the Jewish community of Satu Mare. But Joel Teitelbaum survives for reasons that we can explore later, makes his way first to Switzerland, then to Palestine, even though he was perhaps the most well-known Jewish anti-Zionist of the 20th century, and finally, in September 1946, to New York. Establishes himself in Williamsburg, about which we'll hear much more, but already at that point arrives at the intuition that his community, as he begins to rebuild it from the tattered fragments of the Hungarian Haredi world, with dozens of people, his community will require, in addition to Williamsburg, a center in Williamsburg, a place at a remove from the seductions and allures of the big city. And he entrusts the task to his chief lieutenants to find a space outside of the city that could serve as a kind of spiritual enclave. It takes decades for them to find a suitable piece of land, or better yet, for people to sell a suitable piece of land to a group of Hasidic Jews. And finally, in 1972, land is purchased, as Sarah said, in the town of Monroe, in Orange County, and then 2 years of building 80 garden apartments and 25 single-family homes proceeds. And then in the summer of 1974, the first Satmar settlers begin to make their way from Brooklyn to Orange County, New York. And that's when we begin to see sort of the outbreak of tensions between the Satmar Hasidim and residents and officials of Monroe, the town of Monroe, who have very different ideas of what zoning regulation should look like. And we can elaborate on that at great length. As a result of those tensions, and as an attempt to forestall a lawsuit in federal court slated to take place on October 26, 1976, town officials agreed to carve out of the town of Monroe a village to be known as Kiryas Yom, which is Hebrew or Yiddishized Hebrew for the village of Joel, named after Joel Teitelbaum. From that point forward, Kiryas Joel can regulate its own zoning for its residents, an extremely important development in the history of the community. Although the original conception of Joel Teitelbaum was not to create a legally recognized municipality, it was to create a Shtetl, right, that was a spiritual enclave, a place of safe haven. So, in very quick fashion, the Shtetl became a village, and it went on to achieve, by many discernible measures, enormous success. For example, in the 1980 census, there were 2,000 residents in Kiryas Joel. In 2020, 40 years later, there were 33,000. So a 16-fold growth. Population growth was enormous. The ideals of the sophomore community in terms of education, gender roles, and modesty norms, to take just 3 examples, have been retained as Joel Teitelbaum might have expected. This is a community in which, according to the 2020 census, 96% of the community speaks a language other than English, which is to say Yiddish. This is a cradle-to-grave Yiddish-speaking community. By those measures, Kiryas Yol has been an enormous success. And yet, there are troubles in the village, and they really issue back to the death of Joel Teitelbaum in 1979, which commenced a succession struggle that has not resolved to this day. There have been tensions with non-Satmar neighbors in Orange County, countless lawsuits, countless threats of political and legal action directed against the community and by the community directed against the neighbors surrounding the community. And yet, it seems as if strife has been no deterrent to growth and success in a kind of remarkable way. What I want to conclude by saying, and there's obviously much more to be said, is that in many regards, the community was deemed by residents of Monroe, and still is, as a foreign implant. This is a group of foreign-looking, foreign-speaking, alien people who have settled in our midst and who are taking over our county. A good part of what Nomi and I argue is that this phenomenon of Kiryas Yol is a decidedly American phenomenon. It is an exemplar of what we call religious communitarianism that has deep roots in the history of the United States and the American Republic. There are many examples upon which one could draw, and we will perhaps get to them. But in so many ways, both as an exemplar of religious communitarianism, as a community that actually took rise owing to the instrumentalities of American political and legal strategies and of liberalism itself, and as a product of its own form of assimilation, Kiryas Yol is decidedly American.
So to pick up on that theme and expand a bit on what is so American about this seemingly, and in many ways actually, very foreign insular community. I want to try to make a framing that is implicit in our book, explicit. So, to talk about how this community is American or fits into the larger American story, there are many, many dimensions to Americanness, and one could go way back in time, and we do, to identify the long tradition of the formation of insular, in many ways, separatist, strictly observant religious communities, going all the way back to colonial times, to the settlement of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the original city on the hill. And we do draw that connection to the very long arc of religious communities and religious communitarianism in America, identifying Kiryas Yol as in some ways the Shtetl on the hill. But our book really focuses more specifically on the changes in American culture and society and politics and law that were occurring in the period of time in which the village was being formed. Now, the formation of the village begins in the early 70s. So this is, in point of fact, of course, before the election of Ronald Reagan. But the framing that I said is, I think, implicit in our book, that I want to make explicit, is that the story we tell is in many ways a story with several chapters, the first of which is a Reagan era story. And then there's a Clinton era story. And as David has already discussed a bit, there's a Trump era story. Now you'll notice there's some omissions. I haven't mentioned either of the Bush administrations or the Obama administration. And time permitting, we can talk about why those are sort of a more recessive part of the framing. What I really want to do is begin by talking about the ways in which the Reagan era, which is widely recognized as having effectuated a second, third, depends how you count it, revolution in American politics and society. How formative those changes in the broader context of American society were for the Sommers endeavor, and the extent to which they are explanatory of the success of their endeavor, and also some of the complications that we observe. So, to summarize a very, very big subject, I think there are sort of three focal points or streams or what shall we say, ideological subject areas that were characteristic of the Reagan Revolution. There was the economic agenda, maybe first and foremost, the so-called libertarian agenda, and I'll say a word about why I qualify that by saying so-called. And then, of course, and this is a big part of the story we tell, there is the rise of the religious right, right? Ronald Reagan is elected with the crucial assistance of the moral majority, right? So the Christian-led religious right, the coalition that was formed between evangelical Christians and conservative Catholics, that's a coalition that really is already beginning to be mobilized earlier in the 60s, but it's really in the 70s, and then it's really at the end of the 70s with Ronald Reagan's election that we see the ascendance, the attainment of political influence on the part of the religious right that is shaping the world we live in to this very day. So there's the religious agenda, in addition to the economic agenda, and then of course there is race. So I just want to say a few words briefly about each of those aspects and try to at least hint at how they bear on the Sommer story, and more specifically, the story of those who exited the city and went to the suburbs. I think all of you can readily see the way in which that very familiar story of flight from the cities to the suburbs, largely white flight, in which this branch of the Sommers, the ones we tell our story about, participated in, whereas you tell the story of the Sommers who resisted the trends of white flight to stay in the city. I think that's quite clearly, I think it's readily apparent the extent to which that is a story that fortifies the Reagan era economic themes. It's a story about private property, right? The exaltation of private property and the degree to which access to private property, which is to say access to capital, the ability to purchase land, to develop land, and to control to whom land is sold, is what determines who lives where, and who is able to form enclaves, homogeneous enclaves, in which they are relatively insulated from exposure to other people and the incursions of various levels of governmental authorities. So I think there are pretty obvious ways in which real estate, private property, and the privileging of the rights of private property is a really important part of the explanation of the Satmar's success in forming their enclave in the village, which then they are pretty easily able to transform from being merely a private association into their own officially recognized municipality, a municipal incorporation. That's particularly interesting given the fact that the modal Satmar is poor, is receiving welfare benefits. So there's a complicated story to tell about how, despite the per capita poverty, nonetheless, unlike some other minority communities that are equally or maybe not even as poor, the Satmars were able, through mechanisms that we could describe in more detail in question and answer for anyone who is interested, they were nonetheless able to marshal the requisite capital to be able to acquire and develop land and then ensure that those lots were only sold to members of their community. And now the Reagan rhetoric, the libertarian rhetoric, is a rhetoric of deregulation, right? So again, privileging of private rights, private entrepreneurship, private property over public anything, and decentralization. So I think it's not a coincidence that even though this community is established before Reagan is elected, its flourishing is a part of that Reagan era romance, not only with private property, but with localism, right? The idea of localism. So it's not only deregulation and privatization that is celebrated, but decentralization. I refer to that as so-called libertarianism because there's always been something quite fantastical, illusionary about these claims, because in point of fact, I mean, we all know that although not to deny the reality of privatization, deregulation, and decentralization, but the idea that that led to the dismantling or even just the weakening of the federal government or state levels of government vis-a-vis local government, that's obviously absurd. We know that's not true. And that may seem very contradictory. It makes sense when we sort of pull back and see that everything that is taking place in this era is taking place against the backdrop of what legal historians, for example, Parentoni at Stanford Law School, have referred to as the new American model of governance. What is the new American model of governance? It's a new system, quite different from what existed before, that actually is constructed between the New Deal into the 1970s. This is inherited by the Reagan administration, in which power is redistributed among federal, state, and local governments, among federal, state, and local levels of government, in a way that simultaneously empowers all of them. Even though all of this is being couched in the rhetoric of decentralization, localism, and privatization. So that, and you know, it just so happens that all of, you know, these different levels of empowerment tend to redound to the benefit of the affluent, surprisingly enough. And of course, that has racial skews, unsurprisingly as well. And yet, although that is true, it remains the case that this is a system that creates opportunities for groups that are outside the mainstream. Although, again, it bears emphasis that many of these opportunities, the ability of groups to avail themselves, is heavily dependent upon access to capital, which is the pathway to access to real estate, which is really the ticket to everything. The story of the rise of the religious right is, in some ways, an even more important factor in the changes that are occurring in American law and politics that then redound to the benefit of the Satmars. So we spent a lot of time documenting that story. I think one of the most interesting exemplars of what's happening, and this is where this actually starts to become a Clinton era story, jumping over the first Bush, it bears emphasis that it was not only conservatives, it was not only the religious right, it was not only the political right that was retreating from earlier liberal ideals, ideals of a kind of ideals of integration, as against more separatist forms of community. Those ideals were also being assailed on the left. Everything from the Black Power movement, Black nationalism, and sort of liberal left forms of communitarianism also were taking aim at the integrationist ideals. And you can see that very clearly in the Clinton administration. It's actually in the Clinton era that the changes in the law, both statutory law, so one of the first things the Clinton administration does is it promotes and then gets enacted a law called the Equal Access Act that guarantees that religious groups have the same access to public school buildings for after-school activities that non-religious groups do. And it's in this era that, thanks largely to the activism of Christian conservative religious liberty advocacy groups, the Supreme Court begins to really alter the way in which it interprets the First Amendment in ways that are deeply supportive of, you could call them communitarian, or you could call them separatist endeavors. So these are the kinds of broad scale changes that are occurring in America that create opportunities for the Satmars in particular and other groups like them to be able not only to create the kinds of separatist enclaves that we see illustrated in the American Shtetl of Curious Joel, but then to be able to defend themselves when their separatist political institutions are under attack, legal attack and political attack. So that was the story we tell.
Well, I want to start by thanking Sarah for introducing us and moderating this event, and also the staff of the Leve Center, and especially Chelsea White for all the work that she did. I also want to thank my co-author, Michael, for being such a wonderful partner in this book. And then it's a special pleasure to be here with David and Nomi, and for our books to run on parallel tracks the way they have to come together at this moment. So I want to make 2 historiographical points, and then I want to make describe 4 events or historical processes that really animate the first half of our book. And the first historiographical point I want to make has to do with how did the Satmar themselves, how did the Hasidim themselves view America? One of the things that was most important for Michael and me was not just to describe or analyze how others have portrayed the Hasidim in Williamsburg, this neighborhood in Brooklyn where they settled in the 1940s, but also to tap into the very rich literature, different kinds of genres, whether it's books in Hebrew and Yiddish, whether it's newspapers. They've published a Yiddish newspaper. It's the most widely published, read Yiddish newspaper in the world and has been for decades now. How do they see what's going on themselves? And one of the things that is most important for our book is to note that they had to dramatically reconceptualize how they viewed America. Before they arrived in the United States in the 1940s, they were like other Haredim or Hasidim. They viewed America as a treif in a Medina, as an unkosher land. They even would say that by stepping on the very stones in America, you can become impure. So they refused, in large part, to come here, and many of them, for that reason, were also victims during the Holocaust. They do come here, and at that moment, they have to make a decision. How are they going to understand this place that they're in? And we argue that they do that in what is a typical for them combination of ideology and pragmatism. Strict adherence to an ideology, and in this case, the ideology is really one that is grounded in the Kabbalah, in Jewish mysticism. Okay? And yet you would think that that would be the most distant thing from a kind of pragmatic approach. In fact, they balance the two. And that tension between strict adherence to ideology, which is grounded in Jewish religious tradition, and pragmatism is really the engine that drives the success of the Hasidim in establishing this community in Williamsburg, becoming a community of over 50,000 people, the basis of what will by now become the largest Hasidic community in the world, part of this dramatic rise of Haredi Jewish community more broadly. So how do they reconceptualize America? They don't say that America is a great place. They say, no, America remains a spiritually dangerous place for Jews. In fact, it's the most spiritually low place in the world. But for that very reason, the Hasidim, and especially their leader, Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum, have to arrive in America at the end of days and purify it. They have to engage in what's called in Hasidic thought, Yerida L'tzorach Aliyah, descent in order to ascend. They have to uplift the sparks that are buried in America. And that this is, for them, the final gullus, the final stage of exile. And once they do that, then Mashiach, Messiah, will come, and then the end of the world will occur. Now, not coincidentally, this is connected to their anti-Zionism, which is that aspect of their belief that is the most controversial. How is it connected? Because they say, no, we have this mission to perform in the United States. This is where we have to be. We actually have to be in Brooklyn. We don't have to go to the land of Israel yet. That will come when the Messiah comes, but first we have to do the work that we're doing here. So they actually see the building of their community in this part of Brooklyn, which at the time is one of the poorest neighborhoods in Brooklyn. It happens to be right over the Williamsburg Bridge from Lower Manhattan, so eventually the real estate is going to go up. But at the time, it's extremely poor. So they arrive there. And this leads me to the second historiographical point I want to make, which is that our book tries to intervene in the narrative of American Jewish history, a history that has typically been told as a history of, certainly in the 20th century, these waves of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe arrived. Now, scholars have noted there were also a smaller wave from the Ottoman Empire and elsewhere in North Africa, and elsewhere in the Middle East. But the general picture, the biggest wave is from Eastern Europe. They come, many of them are socialists. Many of them, for example, belong to the Bund, or they're here to make their lives better economically. They quickly assimilate, they stop speaking Yiddish, eventually they move into the suburbs. And that was exemplified by a book some of you may have read, World of Our Fathers by Irving Howe, won the National Jewish Book Award. No, actually won the National Book Award. Won the National Book Award. It's a very impactful book. But what that history ignores is what we write about, which is another wave of immigrants after World War II, who came here to remain religious, to remain Hasidic. They moved into many of the neighborhoods that other Jews were leaving at precisely that time, and they refused to assimilate, even though, we argue, they Americanized in their own ways. And so I think that as a result of our books, and other books that will be published from here on in, when American Jewish history is written, if it is written 100 years from now, this will be part of that narrative. in a way that it hasn't been until now. So the 4 points I want to make, the historical points or historical events. The first is what I would call, or what we call the Hurricanization of Williamsburg, meaning the transformation of Williamsburg into a Haredi enclave. When they arrived in Williamsburg, it was a heavily Jewish neighborhood. It had a large Orthodox community, which is one of the reasons it appealed to them, and it also had low housing prices and a lot of businesses that were it was possible to purchase and to redevelop. How did they do this? They established their own parallel Jewish institutions, schools, kosher butchers, stores, etc. Meaning they refused to go to those institutions that were already there. So we see this separatist move. They also encourage other Jews, especially young people, to become members of their community. And actually many people in their community were not originally Hasidic. They may have been Orthodox, but they become Hasidic. And lastly, they encourage the outflow of other Jews from the neighborhood. So that by the 1960s, 70s, almost all the Jews who remain in Williamsburg are Hasidic. And this is a process that we can see around the world, especially in cities in Israel. Second point, in the late 1950s, early 1960s, to alleviate the housing shortage in Williamsburg, the city of New York builds high-rise public housing projects at a time when many white ethnics who are living in housing projects elsewhere in the city and elsewhere in the country are leaving in droves. Why? Because public housing, especially high-rise public housing, has become associated with racialized poverty. And many whites are embarrassed to live in those places. And they can benefit from things like the GI Bill, from lower mortgage rates, etc. Things that have more recently been studied in extensive detail. The Hasidim in Williamsburg make a move that is unique in New York City at that time for people who, from one perspective, might be included in that category of white ethnics. They move into those public housing buildings in large numbers, in such large numbers that in the 1970s, they're going to be the subject of a lawsuit, or the city of New York will be the subject of a lawsuit, that it was discriminating in their favor. That's how many, in fact, they become the majority in some of those public housing projects. Why do they do that? Well, for one thing, they're not ashamed to live in those public housing projects. Because they have this separatist attitude. Because they're a self-contained community. They're not concerned about what other people think of them. In addition, and something I'll talk about in a second, they're not concerned about what some other people are concerned about who lived in those buildings, which is crime. Because they feel that they can respond to crime as a community. I'll return to that point. And lastly, like most people who move into public housing in that era, and right now too, they see it as a step up from the cold water flats that they were living in at the time. Okay, third point. In the middle 1960s and in the end of the 1960s, the Hasidim participated in what is known as the Great Society programs that Lyndon Johnson initiated. These were anti-poverty programs that were initially intended primarily for whites in Appalachia and blacks in urban areas. But in fact, the Hasidim in New York City become some of the biggest beneficiaries. How do they do that? They become aware of these programs and they develop a new class of activists called oskunim in Yiddish, whose job it is to research those programs, find out how Hasidim can become eligible for them, because many of them are below the poverty line, and then apply for those programs. And they do so to great success. And so in many ways, Hasidim become one of the biggest beneficiaries of many of these government programs in all of New York City. And we argue that that is in fact part of their Americanization. It is also part of their racialization, insofar as in a variety of ways, including where they're living in the housing projects, including their participation in this program, they come to resemble their Puerto Rican and black neighbors much more so in their participation than their Jewish fellow Jews living in the suburbs in that period. Last point has to do with crime. So this is also a period in the 1960s, 70s when we see the crime rate in New York and neighborhoods like Williamsburg increasing dramatically. Many Hasidim are impacted by that directly. And there is the expectation, which you can see from newspapers from that period, that they will run away from their neighborhoods in response to this. And in fact, they take the opposite approach. They double down. They double down by responding to crime by attacking muggers and others who are threatening them. Now this leads to charges of vigilantism, it leads to tension with their neighbors, it also leads to tension with their police, and they had a very contentious relationship with the police dating back already to pre-war Hungary, their experience during the Holocaust, and their experience in the communist era as well. This takes us up to the 1980s, and that's I'm going to hand it over to Michael.
Thank you. That's a good transition, but I want to just interrupt myself to say thank you so much to the Leve Center and Leve Center staff, and just say that it's such an honor to be on this panel with so many excellent scholars and mentors, including 2 members of my dissertation committee, with a special thank you to David Myers for his understanding at my working on this late in my, the same time I was finishing the dissertation. It's hard to summarize in just a few minutes the 5 chapters that make up the second half of our book, but the basic narrative arc of that portion of the book that we trace is one of Hasidic responses to gentrification, which was such a transformative phenomenon in their neighborhood. And that arc goes from a more or less neutral attitude to fierce opposition to gentrification, to engagement and even participation in gentrification. But first, to understand what gentrification meant in Williamsburg, you have to understand the history of the housing stock, which Nathaniel spoke of a little bit. I mean, there had been a shortage of affordable and high-quality housing in Williamsburg since the 1930s, when the first board of the New York City Housing Authority, which included the editor of the Vorwärts Yiddish newspaper, Baruch Vladek, conducted a survey of all real property in New York, and concluded that Brooklyn had the most square miles of slums in any borough. And this prompted the city to construct the second and perhaps most ambitious of its public housing projects in Williamsburg, which was already a Jewish neighborhood. The construction of an expressway through the neighborhood and yet more high-rise public housing displaced thousands of people over the course of the 1950s and 1960s. And yet Hasidim remained and even fought to gain units in public housing. But the most significant shift in terms of real estate that allowed for gentrification in Williamsburg, beginning in the 1980s, was the movement of the garment industry, first to the American South and later overseas. The abandonment of factory buildings, especially along the waterfront, and Williamsburg's waterfront had been an important commercial and manufacturing corridor since the 19th century, appealed to artists priced out of Soho and the East Village, and who began to trickle into the area and squat in these properties or live illegally so they could, make their work in large spaces. And as this community of artists grew, some Hasidic factory owners, such as Louis Kestenbaum, one I'll speak of in a little bit, and whom we profile in the book, allowed artists to build out illegal but officially sanctioned loft apartments in these commercially zoned spaces. And at that time, Williamsburg was still notorious for its crime and open drug markets. And the artists who opted to live in such an environment were merely a curiosity for Hasidim, or for those who even noticed them. And they were sometimes viewed as a positive presence in the neighborhood and their underused buildings. So that by 1992, a New York Magazine cover story announced Williamsburg as the new Bohemia, yet further contributing to the growth of the community. It would take about a decade for artists to move out of the waterfront and into the Polish and Puerto Rican neighborhoods surrounding it, and finally to the edge of the Hasidic South Side, and put Hasidim and artists in direct conflict. Hasidim, with their large families and modest incomes, still faced a housing shortage. In 2002, about 50,000 Hasidim lived in Williamsburg, and the neighborhood had the lowest rate of homeownership in the city compared to other Jews, a rate of about 23%. While another study showed that Hasidim were heavily rent burdened, meaning that 1/3 spent over 60% of their income on rent. And it was in this context of vulnerability that in 2003, Hasidim launched an anti-gentrification campaign they referred to as the War Against the Artists, an episode to which we devote an entire chapter. Employing militant and biblical rhetoric, disciples of Yoel Teitelbaum led this anti-gentrification campaign on religious and moral grounds. The development that started it all was the former Gretsch Guitar Factory on the south side, meaning the Hasidic side of Broadway in Brooklyn. What made this situation and really this whole era of gentrification complicated was that it was being developed by two Orthodox men from a different part of Brooklyn. Hasidim opposed gentrification not only because it shrank their already limited territory. What made gentrification different from previous housing issues was the particular character of these artists, these so-called artists who were moving in, and their immoral behavior, such as dressing immodestly, cackling in public, as one person told us, letting their dogs urinate on the sidewalk, etc. But the artists also upset the delicate ethnic ecosystem that Hasidim had adapted to so well over the decades. Most of the artists were white, and according to this campaign, which was waged in the pages of Der Yid and Der Blatt, another large Hasidic newspaper that was founded in 2000, and also waged in public protests, Hasidic children could now see something of themselves in the artists and had the idea of becoming one of them. While the War Against the Artists anticipated grassroots anti-gentrification movements that targeted artists specifically, such as one that occurred here in Los Angeles in Boyle Heights, the Hasidic version was decidedly top-down in its organization. And while it was successful in driving out Orthodox developers, the Gretsch building was ultimately developed into luxury condos, and the tsunami of gentrification proved that this method of protest would be futile. Fast forward just a few years to 2005. That year, the Williamsburg waterfront was rezoned, freeing up many Hasidic-owned factories for residential development. And actually, the rezoning was organized around this one Hasidic property owner, Louis Kestenbaum's garment factory, that he had received a housing variance for on his own. Those same garment factories that once employed thousands of Hasidim until the mid-90s were now the cradle of a new industry that gave work opportunities to Hasidim with a wide variety of skill sets, from construction, electrical work, and HVAC, to running a lumber yard on Kent Avenue, to property management, to buying and renting properties. The real estate industry, which replaced the garment industry and other industries that bottomed out, such as the diamond industry, also opened up new employment opportunities for Satmar women, such as Chani Rosen, a real estate expediter who followed the community's conventions among women of not driving and yet facilitated high-profile real estate deals during the day. The economic crash and burst housing bubble a few years later led to a wave of foreclosures that hit the neighborhood surrounding Williamsburg especially hard. Bedford-Stuyvesant, a large neighborhood to the immediate south of Williamsburg, saw some of the highest rates of foreclosure in the city. And just as banks and other investors were pulling out of this housing market, Hasidim had a unique opening to expand the availability of housing in their area. This was partly facilitated by the common Hasidic practice of privately financing real estate transactions rather than relying on banks, and by a more general entrepreneurialization of real estate in this period that Hasidim participated in. For example, by taking self-help courses in Yiddish that primed Hasidim for the housing industry, complete with Yiddish-English housing dictionaries of housing terms. I still haven't gotten my hands on that. Hasidim, of course, had unique ties to the neighborhood that other investors didn't. And when the housing market began to recover, at least in New York City, just a few years later, some Hasidim became some of the most important players in New York City real estate with their new holdings and formed a new class of economic elite in the Hasidic community, and also gave rise to a new type or stereotype of the Hasidic landlord, which may be familiar to some of you from series such as Unorthodox or other literature and journalism from the period. So in the book, we trace the rise of the Hasidic real estate mogul by looking at a few examples of how Hasidim entered the real estate market and became successful. One person we write about and whom we interviewed was named Meyer Schwartz. Schwartz was not born into a real estate family, but grew up in Borough Park, another large Hasidic neighborhood, and attended Kollel in Williamsburg after getting married, this subsidized study for a year or two. But his father-in-law had run a knitting factory that closed, and because Schwartz saw himself as a naturally curious person who prided himself on thinking outside the box, he personally investigated the artists he had heard were moving into factories and convinced his family to let him convert the factory not only into lofts, but also on the ground floor into a mini mall, complete with a record store, bookstore, yoga studio, internet cafe, etc. He was partly inspired by a Hasidic figure named Nachman Brach, who was already renting to artists in a no-frills former pasta factory in the neighborhood that became known to residents as the kibbutz on Kent Avenue. But by catering directly to the sensibilities of and the commercial interests of the neighborhood's new clientele, Schwartz represented a shift in attitudes towards the artists and gentrification, towards the artists and to gentrification in general, that would become a model for other developers. Another person we write about in the book is named Louis Kestenbaum. Kestenbaum's father, Tzvi, Holocaust survivor, was one of the community activists, important community activists that Nathaniel mentioned, who founded a nonprofit called the ODA, or Opportunity Development Association. And he helped procure a special designation for Hasidim as a disadvantaged non-Caucasian minority. Kestenbaum, like Schwartz's in-laws, was in the garment industry and owned a factory on the north side, which he rented to artists. And after successfully lobbying the city for a zoning variance to convert to residential, the waterfront was rezoned around his property, parlaying Kestenbaum into a successful real estate career. Like his father, the community activist, Kestenbaum used his position to contribute to the Hasidic community, especially as a philanthropist. However, in 2015, Kestenbaum's company successfully bid $240 million for the closed Long Island Hospital in Brooklyn. The special designation that Tzvi Kestenbaum had secured was designed to, quote, help ethnic groups compete effectively within the American economic mainstream. So along with the more recent trend in Hasidic Williamsburg to build Hasidic gyms, upscale restaurants, and stores that specialize in kosher cannabinoids, we can now see how far the generation of Louis, the son, had come from the world of their fathers.
Wonderful. I think you have a fair sampling from those presentations with their erudition, their analytic muscle, and their crispness. What a treat you have in the books that you can purchase behind you. Here's what we're going to do. We have a little under half an hour. I'm going to offer 3 questions, and I'm going to open the floor for more. And then we are going to invite our speakers to answer whatever they wish. And I hope that we can somehow encourage them to speak to each other as much as speaking individually. So here are my 3, and then the floor is open. I think all of the presenters referenced the ways in which these books analytically dovetail and historically dovetail, but I would love to hear your reflections on where they analytically depart. Secondly, it is so striking to me that these 2 massive contributions to the study of Haredi culture come from scholars in California, and I'd love to hear why. Finally, this number, David, that you offered of the year 2040, 1 in 4 Jews worldwide will be Haredi defined, is so striking. So what would be the future of Jewish history looking forward to that era and after? Those are my questions, and the floor is open for more. I don't think we have traveling microphones, so I just invite you to raise your hand and speak loudly if you have a question to add.
I wonder if I could address, I wonder if I could address the question about how we diverge. So I'm not sure that we so much diverge in terms of analysis, but it's the fact that we focus on these different communities. I mean, they're two places that are very, very different in a variety of ways, even though they're members of the same community, and they do move back and forth, although, you know, as David and Nomi indicated, there's also tension between them. And so I want to focus on race and racialization. The experience of Hasidim in Williamsburg is one in which, since the 1950s, certainly since the 60s, their neighbors have primarily been, well, they were Puerto Rican initially, some African Americans, other Latinos, and that's simply not the case in Kiryas Yale. It's one of the most homogenous communities in the country, probably. I mean, you can give figures about that. And so, whereas David and Nomi's book looks at, for example, some of the ways in which Kiryas Yale is similar to Christian evangelical communities or to white Christian evangelicals. In our case, the parallels, the similarities, especially in the 50s, 60s, 70s, up to gentrification, are really with their Puerto Rican and black neighbors. And you know, Michael mentioned that at some point they are even officially designated by the Minority Development and Minority Business Development Agency, which is a government agency, as disadvantaged minority group. Other Jews are not, just Hasidim, and that's still in the books today. I Googled it today just to see whether it was still the case, and it is. And so that just shows you how, that they were conscious of this process. Now that isn't to say that they were identical with their neighbors. Obviously, in many ways they weren't. But that relationship is very, very different. And so that's one thing that strikes me.
Thank you. Anyone, shall we wait and take some questions before you reflect? Let's invite comments. Omar in the back.
First of all, I would like to thank all the panelists for this really brilliant panel. I learned so much. For me, I have a question and a comment. It's really refreshing to see historians and legal historians of Judaism bring a discussion about a particular religious group, unlike a lot of political scientists and sometimes anthropologists that have always focused on political Salafism in Islam. And I think it's really interesting to think about this, what's happening in Judaism and the Jewish world in comparison to the Islamic world. So that I see really a lot of comparative notes here. My question related to Ayala Fader's book, which is an ethnographic work based on from a different perspective on this community. I want you to reflect on your work as a legal historian as well as historians and how we can compare that work that has been done by an anthropologist to the work that you have done, even though I think there is a lot of ethnographic detail in both books. I've read in Nomi and David's book. I haven't read the other book. I'm really looking forward to read the other book, but it's really, I want to see what kind of perspective the anthropologist and the historian bring to understanding this community.
Wonderful, thank you. We're going to continue accruing questions, so I hope you're taking notes. Please.
Yeah, so it's great to be with you guys. It's also great to see so many mentors of mine together in person for an event, and thank you for a wonderful talk. So I have a question about Hasidic Jews, political affiliation, and United States Hasidic Jews relationships to other social groups in the Trump and post-Trump era United States. So as some of you have already touched on, post-2016 we saw a strong rightward pro-Trump turn amongst Hasidic Jews in the United States. And my question is, how did this rightward political shift affect Hasidic Jews' relationships with their Black, Latino, and Hispanic neighbors, at the same time as we saw a parallel strengthening of the progressive left?
Wonderful, thank you, Avery. Anyone else wish to add a question to the list? Yes, Natalie.
coincidentally or not, your books come at a time also when there's increased representation, Hasidic representation in mainstream media, such as Netflix shows, such as Unorthodox, and some of the other ones that are related. So I'd be curious to read you also reflect on the timing of this, whether it's coincidental or not, and also what role you play as scholars in combating some of the narratives of these shows, which are oftentimes harmful and or inaccurate to the history.
Thank you. I haven't seen any other hands, so, oh, there are more hands. Wonderful. Rachel.
Hi. I was wondering if you guys could reflect a little bit on how individual Satmar Jews understand these power dynamics. Michael, you mentioned a few kind of key figures that you guys follow, but I'd be really curious to know how they think about those kind of classifications. Like, do they think they are legitimately using the minority classification, or do they think, look, there's a system and I can use it to my advantage, or just how you think about the individual actions?
Thank you.
This doesn't pertain to this particular panel because you're all here because you've written recent books, but it pertains to you as academics who often convene other panels of your own, and as you've seen, I've come quite often through the years. I'm wondering, do Hasidim ever get invited to speak on panels, and do they refuse, or are they not invited to, this would be not just UCLA, but academic panels on either coast? Do they refuse to participate, or are they simply shunned from ever speaking at all?
Thank you. Other hands? Wonderful. So we have about 20 minutes, and I'm going to let you duke it out for time. Whoever wishes to go first.
Well, maybe you want to go first.
Okay. I would love to address Omar's question about the different methodologies. I know David and I both
Can you
have.
speak a little louder?
I was going to say, I would love to address Omar's question about the difference between the methods of the anthropologist and the historian, and to that I would add, since I'm none of the above, a legal analyst and legal theorist. But I hope we can get back to that question. I wanted to get back to, I think, a number of the questions, starting with your first question, Sarah, about the divergences, and Nathaniel's response really bring our attention to, I think, this really important question of race and where are the Satmars and Hasidic Jews and Haredi Jews more generally located in the racial imaginary and in official racial classifications. And I completely agree that among the most significant differences between the subject of your book, the Hasidim in the city, and the subject of our book is precisely what you said, Nathaniel, which is that at least up until the invasion of the Artistim, who are predominantly white, the Hasidim in Williamsburg, the others with whom they are interacting are not white, right? It's Puerto Ricans, blacks. That's the racial ecology in which they live. Whereas, as you absolutely correctly observed, the Satmars who go to the suburbs are living in a predominantly white surrounding. There's two really important questions here that I think we both of our books address, but I don't think anyone has really gotten to the bottom of them. One is, and I think this is the last question, I think was raising this, what is their race perceived, how are they officially categorized? Are they categorized as white or as not white? Do they see themselves as white or not white? Do they understand that just to be kind of an available thing, kind of legal category they can avail themselves of to get what they don't realize? So one is sort of what is their race, and the other, which is not the same, but essential, what are their racial attitudes, right? What do they think about Black people and Puerto Ricans and other people who are perceived to be and who define themselves as racial minorities? You might think, and I think, right, you suggested, maybe by virtue of staying, not participating in white flight, and instead deciding to stay among non-whites, maybe that made them not white. On the other hand, right, as you suggested, right, their whole theory was, oh, if we're only surrounded by Black and brown people, our kids won't want to be like them. They won't be tempted. It's only when the white people should. Well, that suggests, maybe they do think of themselves as what. So there's something much more complicated going on. And similarly, right, conversely, the Sodomers who go to the suburbs, does that make them more white? In some ways, it's just the opposite. Certainly, and this goes back to the importance of the story of real estate and access to property. Even before they get to Monroe, they've been excluded, they've been prevented from settling elsewhere by the mechanisms of exclusionary zoning, the kinds of zoning ordinances that are typical of suburbs that come to be characterized in the 70s by civil rights activists who bring legal challenges against them, who say you have all these zoning ordinances and building ordinances that are not explicitly racially discriminatory or explicitly excluding the poor, but that is their effect, and indeed that's their intended effect. And in many ways, the Sodomers find themselves on the victim side of exclusion. They are the excluded. So you might say, well, that kind of makes them non-white. But then there are many, many ambiguities in how they are they white or are they not white? Even if they're not white, are they somehow like racial minorities by virtue of being different from mainstream whites? Are they, we're not white too? Or are they absorbing racist attitudes towards other non-whites that they live near, which might be, the real sign of Americanization?
And I would just add to that the question, do they have power, political power, or are they powerless? So to take the case of Curious Hill, you're talking about a community that in the 2010 census had the largest percentage of people who live below the poverty line in the country, over 60%. In 2020, that number shrank to 45%. But still, you're talking about what would be a conventional marker of disempowerment. And yet, leaders in the community proudly tell me they can pick up the phone and reach the governor of the state of New York or the United States senators in the state of New York, in an instant, and they will take their call. So it's this interesting complication and ambiguity over what race, what power means. And here I do want to just, if I may, go back to Sarah's first question and Nathaniel's response about divergences. I mean, for the sake of argument, let me pick an argument. So I totally agree about this tension between, or coexistence of ideology and pragmatism in the community. I, for my part, never encountered anyone who had adopted that very instrumental view of existence in the United States as part of the ultimate scheme of redemption, sort of a very standard feature of Kabbalistic cosmology and teleology, made most famous in Sappho in the 16th century, and then in the Ottoman Empire in the case of Shabtai Tzvi in the 17th century. What I did see, and this is a variation on the theme, Nathaniel, was, and the language people I spoke to, very frequently would frame in the same sentence their existence in the United States as unmistakably a manifestation of what they would call golus, of exile. Like, we are in a state of exile. And at the same time, they would hasten to express appreciation for the United States as a malchus shel chesed, as a kingdom of grace, unique in Jewish diaspora history. And they sort of tack between those two poles in understanding their place. And I think that's related to the sense of being both disempowered and possessed of power. the impulse to accommodate that we all have identified, to sort of make use of instrumentalities and modalities of legal and political power, existed prior to the arrival of the Satmar Hasidim to the United States. I mean, this is sort of an old Jewish communal tradition, and it's a tradition that Rabbi Yoelish himself made use of. There was, upon arrival in the United States, a new audacity and sense of entitlement in using one's instruments of accommodation and even political power. And I think there, the deployment of those tools moves between a sense of kind of intoxication that we really have the ability to make use of our political power for the benefit of our community, and at the same time some sense of modesty and humility and sort of tactical silence, lest the community be perceived as too overt in its use of power. There's a constant tension between those two poles, and I think part of what Nomi and I are saying, and Nathaniel was saying in his opening response to Sarah, is there's a constant movement between poles within the community when it comes to self-identity vis-a-vis the rest of America, the use of political power, and even the very core understanding of the United States. So there's much more to be said. There are many other questions I want to respond to, but I don't think Michael has had a chance.
I think I want to just respond to the question about did people like Louis Kestenbaum, know about or use the special designation they had? It's a very good question. And as far as we know, it hasn't been used. But it's interesting to note that in the business deal I mentioned about buying the Long Island Hospital, Kestenbaum's main competitor was an African-American developer who then expressed some grievances in the press that it didn't go to him but went to Kestenbaum's company. So it is a complicated story, but I think it speaks to this bigger question, maybe touching on the ethnography question too, about our position and do Hasidim understand our approach to their history in Williamsburg at all? It's partly because of the sources we use. The newspapers like their Yid, but also archival sources. For example, the archives of the New York City Housing Authority, or the municipal archives in New York, and the papers of a deputy mayor who was involved in community affairs and policing in Williamsburg. And I do think that, so our approach isn't necessarily relying on all of the same sources that a lot of the internal community histories use to tell their story. And although we did speak to people, and we had permission to speak to human subjects, and interviews were important for us for some of this story. But I would say that Hasidim, there's been an interesting response among Hasidim to our book, and I'm sure to yours too, on chat rooms and that we've heard personally through emails and so forth. And it seems that Hasidim are surprised by some of our findings and our narrative, and they're interested in that. And it's just not, they may know of, for example, the crime wave in the 70s, how Hasidim, how their parents' generation responded to crime, but they might not have known about debates in the Yiddish press about how much physical force was appropriate to use when holding down a mugger, and so that's kind of the story we try to tell, and it's not necessarily one that that the Hasidim themselves or community leaders would tell themselves.
I just want to answer or respond to, a couple of the questions quickly. One, Rachel, whether or not the Hasidim would believe in that designation, disadvantaged minority group. I'd say, or whether it's just an instrumental thing. I'd say actually both, but not necessarily that they think that they think, and this gets to the racialization question too. For them, the most fundamental distinction is between a Jew and a non-Jew. That's the ontological That is the fundamental distinction. Not whether they're black, white, person of color. All of that is not fundamental to them. That doesn't mean that some of them aren't racist and that they haven't been influenced by, American notions of race. Of course they have been, very profoundly. But on some level, they're always operating with this other taxonomy between Jew and non-Jew, which gets played out in all sorts of ways. And so from that perspective, and also remember that this is a community that had experienced the Holocaust. And so they were, in very profound ways, discriminated against, to put it in those terms, right? In racial terms, even if the racial taxonomies of the Nazis were false and so on. And at the same time, they do see many of these things instrumentally. They're pragmatists. And this gets to the question, Avery, your question about the local the politics. How has voting for Trump influenced their relationship with their neighbors? Well, they actually vote typically for Democrats on the local level. Their voting patterns on the local level are different than many people who vote for Trump on the national level will be voting for.
Just to qualify, and you know it well, they vote for winners.
Right, and why do they vote for Democrats? Not because those are the people who are going to win. And so they may disagree with some of their neighbors about the particular candidate, and they do. And I won't go into the details about some of the recent candidates that they have disagreed with, but that's one of the ways in which, in some ways, they're more in line with their neighbors, simply because they're voting for the winners in New York politics, at least. And then the question of Hasidim on panels. I actually was on a panel with a Hasidic guy from Williamsburg once, years ago in Canada. And it is fairly rare, I would say. But as Michael was indicating, they are reading our books. I mean, I sent David a thing. There are Yiddish chat rooms, and our book has like 5,000 views on this in this chat. People talking about it, posting, and the same with their book. And they talk about it in Yiddish, and they say, well, who are these guys? What's their story? They're very curious. And Omar, this speaks to your point. There's ethnography going on in the opposite direction, if you want to say, right? We're the subjects of their curiosity and their speculation, like all communities on this planet. They have opinions too. Very well developed opinions, and they're curious.
Not just opinions. They are, just to accentuate the point, as interested in us. Those who are interested in us. Yeah. But when I would go to the community, to a certain circle, I was in here. I want to just qualify the ontological divide that I think Nathaniel very correctly pointed out in sort of Haredi understandings between Jew and non-Jew. At a practical level, there's another distinction, and that is between Haredi Jews and other Jews. And so at some level, when I showed up initially looking like I did, I was illegible to them. But they didn't know how to read me. Like, here's a guy who says he's interested in writing about our community, but how could he possibly know anything? So over the course of time, it became known that I knew a lot about the history of the community. And people would even summon friends and say, here's a guy who knows something about the community, ask him a question. And if I answered it correctly, they'd be very impressed. And over time, people began to ask me, from the beginning, they would ask, why are you here? Why are you interested in us? And so that ethnographic gaze, Omar, really moved in both directions, in the most fascinating, and I think in some sense enriching ways. And I think this connects, there's some of the questions, this connects to one of the questions, I think it was Natalie's question about, do you feel any particular ethical imperative to correct misimpressions? And the answer is, I do, absolutely yes. And it gets as simple, when speaking in Reformed temples, to communicate that Haredim and Samar Hasidim are people. There's sort of this kind of fantastical and somewhat detached understanding. People are people, and as I often say, we encounter people who are in the community who are very smart, and some are less intellectual, some are really interested in what we do, some are don't. some who are really funny, some whose sense of humor is more muted. And part of what we, I think, feel is our moral imperative is to convey that richness and complexity within a seemingly monochromatic, monodimensional world.
So I just want to add something, and I think this, as David's last remark already did, bring us to Omar's question about methodology. I want to jump in because we've talked about race, we've talked about economics, obviously we're talking about religion, we haven't spoken about gender. And, you know, we blended our two respective expertises, if that's the right word, and each of us stretched beyond our training, and as David just said, he did some ethnographic work, and I didn't. Right? David went to the community, and I almost, I had a couple of brief forays in. That's not to say I interviewed lots of people. I interviewed many, lawyers and other people outside the community who have played important roles vis-a-vis or inside the community. And I spoke with some people, a woman inside the community was the most significant activist on behalf of children with special needs that played a very significant role in developments in the community. I and David both really benefited from speaking to quite extraordinary people who are among the community of people who grew up in these communities and have left, the exiters. But I did not go to the community, and I want to explain why, because I think it's significant, particularly with respect to sort of gender issues. None of us have said it yet. I hope everyone understands. This is a community that adheres to extremely traditional notions of gender, divisions of gender role, and very, very traditional ideas of gender. It was clear, well, let's just start with David, right? Not that he didn't undertake to and succeed in meeting with some women, but it was just, it was a foregone conclusion that men were going to be much, much more accessible to David, and probably all the more so to me, right, than women would be. And in general, the public face of the public side of the community. And so we knew there was going to be a gender skew to that kind of work. And we thought really long and hard about it. We were really concerned. How do you overcome that? There's just inevitably going to be a male bias in the work. And this partly goes to the California, where maybe if I had not lived on the opposite side of the country, it might have been more feasible. But I really felt that the only way one could really gain access to the private sphere, where women are largely located, it would require a much more long-term embedded participant observation form of ethnographic study that wasn't within the realm of possibility for either of us by virtue of our training, our geographic location, and in different ways our gender. So we just had to come to terms with that and then seek to use other methodologies to compensate for that, but at the end of the day, actually just to recognize the limits of our ability to overcome that gender bias in sort of the accessibility of men's and women's experiences, respectively.
Thank you. I hate to intervene because I know we could talk all night, but we do want to offer you the chance to come and ask personal questions, to buy books, to have them signed, and I think I may propose that it may be easiest to have you four sign from here. And anyone who wishes to come up, we'll shut the mic so you'll have some privacy. But there are books in the back, and I want to give a large warm-handed round of applause for our speakers. Thank you so much, and I'd love to see you at our next